So this is a strange time in which to be delivering a lecture, and it's a strange way to deliver a lecture. Or at least it was strange until the coronavirus pandemic upended our assumptions about normal ways of doing things and about where our world is headed. That same sense of a world that has been disrupted and is by necessity challenged to think afresh is something on which I want to reflect this evening in relation to the challenge of global poverty. To a degree that we've not seen since the collapse of the Soviet bloc, efforts to end global poverty are at a crossroads. Put simply, COVID-19 is the biggest setback in a generation to international development. By next year, the economic downturn it's triggered could plunge 150 million more people below the extreme poverty line of $1.90 a day, according to the World Bank. Hunger and unemployment is rising in a way that we've not seen since the 1970s, with the International Labour Organization predicting that 245 million jobs will have been destroyed in the last trimester of 2020. School closures, which at one point affected children in 90% of countries around the world, threaten to have a lifelong impact, especially on the 11 million girls who UNESCO predicts may never return to an education. Many of these girls will marry early, and their children are likely to inherit the poverty and disadvantage that that creates. It's sometimes said that the virus doesn't discriminate, but we know from the social and economic impacts here in the UK that COVID has laid bare and often deepened pre-existing inequalities. This same pattern has been replicated globally in the sudden unemployment of tens of millions of mostly Dalit migrant workers in India, or in the ways in which lockdowns have exposed women to an increased risk of domestic violence. COVID has also exposed new fault lines. In a world of lockdowns and social distancing, the digital divide has become a new driver of poverty and marginalization. And in a world where immunization is a passport out of lockdown, unequal access to life-saving vaccines threatens to create a two-speed recovery from the crisis. While the UK government has secured early access to 350 million vaccines through 6 developers, at the World Health Assembly in May, it opposed a global patent pool which would have encouraged the production of coronavirus drugs that are affordable for the poorest countries. COVID has not struck a world that was previously on a path towards sustainably ending extreme poverty. This is not to say that extraordinary achievements haven't been made in the last half century, whether we measure it by literacy or child mortality or nutrition. To paraphrase Monty Python, we should be careful to avoid the facile question, what has international development ever done for us? But it's precisely because we live in a world with sufficient resources to end extreme want that we should regard the status quo as unacceptable. COVID has spread in a world where rates of poverty reduction were already slowing. It has spread in a world that was simultaneously failing to provide a social floor for hundreds of millions of people, while at the same time breaking through the environmental ceiling of our common home. Profound as the impacts of COVID-19 on global poverty are, and we should remind ourselves that these impacts are still unfolding, the pandemic is also creating massive social and political fallout. Governments have been sorely tested as they struggle with the age-old balance between security and freedom, or else have used the pandemic as a pretext to clamp down on liberties and restrict rights. At a more fundamental level, the pandemic is shaking assumptions about the steady march of progress, and for the first time exposing many people, including people in wealthier countries like Britain, to a sense of insecurity and unpredictability, and perhaps an uneasy feeling that our institutions and familiar patterns of living are less permanent than we had thought. The brutal killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis in May sparked a summer of protest that spread around the world and added to a sense of an old order being destabilized. Continued racial inequality and discrimination has raised searching questions about whether, as Martin Luther King described it, the arc of the moral universe really does bend towards justice. It has also generated a challenge to those like me working in international development, with a growing clamour for the aid system to decolonise and shift power from offices in London, Washington, and New York to people in poverty. So, as well as providing a major practical challenge to international development, COVID-19 has accelerated an intellectual challenge to dominant approaches to poverty reduction. There is a growing political conversation in this country and elsewhere about how to build better from the pandemic and not return to a world that, in its levels of inequality and environmental destruction, was very far from normal. Therefore, now feels like a good time to critically examine our thinking about development. And in doing this, it's worth asking if there is such a thing as a Christian approach to tackling poverty, and if so, whether it can offer a more positive vision for the future. It perhaps helps to begin at the beginning. The origins of development theory can be traced to European Enlightenment ideas about the rationality and perfectibility of human beings, which played out in the French Revolution and its aftermath. These ideas were further shaped by the tectonic shifts of 19th century industrialization in Europe, which transformed societies in such radical ways that a new account was needed, not only of change through time, but also of why some places and peoples were modern, so to speak, and others were not. Kant's idea of a universal history, subsequently developed by Hegel and then stripped of its metaphysics by Marx, answered this need by telling a story of a linear, if dialectical, progression towards a better world. Alongside this new philosophy and the emerging social science of economics, disciplines such as anthropology were created, which dissected and schematized pre-modern cultures. Economically and technologically advanced societies in Europe and North America were increasingly to be seen as developed, with other less developed societies involved in a game of catch-up. If these modern theories of development inherit from Christianity a teleology, a sense of history's final purpose and destination, they depart from Christianity in placing that destination firmly in this world. And of course, in doing this, they opened the door more widely to utopian political projects. John's vision of a new heaven and a new earth increasingly became, in the hands of social scientists, a new earth only. A particular historical experience, initially of a small number of northwestern European countries, was, in the 19th and 20th centuries, generalized into an increasingly all-encompassing theory about cultural and economic advancement. And, as European economic and cultural dominance grew, a mythology of power developed around it that was used to buttress the colonial enterprise. Non-Western societies and particular racial and ethnic groups were widely seen to have varying capacities to successfully develop themselves, an idea that at different points has received support not only from the social sciences, but from many churches and many Christians. It's an idea that has often been employed to justify extreme and systematic violence and exploitation, from the forced destruction of indigenous cultures to the segregation of apartheid South Africa. Arguably, these ideas continue to play out today, whether it is in exploitative trade and investment practices justified by the need for development, or in states imposing a right to development on subject populations, from the people of the Amazon to the Uyghurs and Tibetans of China. The post-war development sector, centered on the newly created Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations, was in many ways driven by concerns that were more practical than theoretical. Initially, these focused on the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, and subsequently on aiding the post-colonial states of Africa and Asia. Yet even if development organizations often drew on development theory implicitly rather than explicitly, the sector continues to be shaped by spatially and temporally loaded ideas, from language about people who are left behind and hard to reach, to narratives of underdevelopment. For many social theorists, religious belief and practice was and is a key part of this account. The secularization thesis held that as societies became richer, religion would wither, to be relegated to the private sphere and replaced by more rational worldviews. But as well as being a mark of economic and cultural backwardness, religiosity was also widely seen as a barrier to development by tying people to tradition and extended family in ways that inhibit the emergence of a more mobile, individualized, and market-oriented society. This has led to some strange and largely unspoken tensions within the international development sector. There is a recognition, with varying degrees of acceptance and understanding, that in poorer countries, religion is a fact on the ground, which profoundly shapes people's thoughts and actions, and with which development actors need to engage. In many cases, this is motivated by a desire to change social practices, such as child marriage or female genital mutilation, that may have some form of religious backing. In other cases, the capacity of religious institutions to mobilize and engage larger numbers of people is seen as critical to development outcomes in areas such as public health and good governance. It's also the case that faith-based organizations have played and continue to play a disproportionate role in efforts to tackle poverty. To take a few examples, healthcare in Africa, the fair trade movement, campaigning for debt cancellation, the global expansion of education. These would all have been very different without the involvement of faith-based actors. What's received much less attention and is regarded less favorably in mainstream development circles is the idea that religious approaches to development might offer a fuller approach to human flourishing. As Sabina Al-Khairi, director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, has put it, there's more openness to Christians doing development than there is to doing Christian development. Yet, at a point where I would argue mainstream development theories are running out of road, there are at least three areas where I believe the international development sector could profit from a deeper engagement with Christian thought. Firstly, there is the fundamental question of how we conceive of progress. It is important to acknowledge the valuable work in recent decades on human development that has built on the foundations of Amartya Sen, Babul al-Haq, and other economists. One result of this work has been the elaboration of multidimensional definitions of poverty, which are reflected in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, in practice, mainstream development approaches continue to be dominated by a focus on individual consumption and growth. The rankings of countries, according to their level of development, defaults to measures of per capita gross domestic product or gross national income. High growth rates are celebrated as a mark of success in World Bank and IMF outlook reports and in the pages of The Economist. The principal measure of extreme poverty of $1.90 a day risks reducing poverty reduction to an exercise in shunting large numbers of faceless people across an arbitrarily defined line. And it's a line which, as anyone living on $2 a day would tell you, is also arbitrarily low. I'm not arguing that income does not matter. Money and choice are important, especially in a situation where either of them is in short supply. But still, we need to ask, for what? A uniform focus on growth ignores the fact that social and political priorities should reasonably be expected to change at different levels of prosperity. Once people's needs are met, rising incomes have a diminishing impact on well-being indicators such as health and on people's reported levels of happiness. And beyond a certain level, the pursuit of wealth and growth becomes environmentally and socially destructive. This is especially the case in a world of extreme levels of income inequality, such as the one we live in, where growth has become highly inefficient at reducing poverty. We live in an economic system where, in the absence of more ambitious redistribution, for poor people to become marginally less poor, rich people must become significantly richer. Rather than seeing development as a linear process of accumulation and acquisition, we would do better to approach extreme poverty as a continual striving for a just sharing of the Earth's resources, which has to be renewed in every generation. From a Christian perspective, this chimes with the view of development as about being more, not having more. Too often, development has been a contest between competing materialisms. Both statist and market fundamentalist approaches to development have a history of trampling on human dignity, from the forced collectivization of agriculture under communist governments to the structural adjustment programs of the International Monetary Fund in 1980s Africa and Latin America. Both materialisms are rooted in a reductive view of humankind. One tends towards the valorization of power and to treating people as the subjects of vast impersonal forces. The other towards a fetishization of choice and to treating people as atomized, self-interested beings. Development sorely needs to be anchored in a more realistic account of what it is to be human. Richard Sennett has asked the question, what kind of human being does current global market practice presuppose? And what kind of human being does it nurture? Is it the sort of human being we want to be caught in a train carriage with? A fuller, more emotionally convincing vision of development needs to reclaim virtues like love, equality, and solidarity that have been increasingly relegated to the private sphere. These are virtues without which we risk being drawn into ever tighter circles of concern and care. And in abandoning the public square to the organizing principles of choice and competition, we risk abandoning not just those people who for different reasons struggle to compete, but we also relinquish any meaningful idea of our common humanity. Anna Rowlands wrote in a recent essay on Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, we should not only ask the question, who is my neighbor, but how can I be a neighbor? Any satisfactory answer to that question has many dimensions, but in approaching it, it is worth touching on 2 points. One is that as relational creatures, we flourish when others around us flourish, and we suffer when they don't, even if we don't always recognize what is happening to us as suffering. We need always to remind ourselves that by creating a distance between people, poverty dehumanizes the rich man as well as the poor woman. It's surprising how little of the policy and political conversation about poverty in this country and globally, and about how to tackle it, is connected to the question of wealth, who has it and how it was acquired. So development cannot ultimately be about some people gaining at the expense of others, or about an improvement in the living conditions of a majority of people, while an unfortunate minority are bypassed according to some kind of utilitarian calculation. Development has to be, from a Christian perspective, about the flourishing of all God's people. A further point on which we could usefully reflect is that, at its heart, poverty and injustice are manifestations of broken relationships between people and the environment that sustains human life, and between people and God. Whether we look at the current crisis of unsustainable debts worsened by COVID-19, or at a global tax system that allows some of the world's most powerful corporations to pay negligible sums into public coffers and in effect shift the tax burden onto the poor, we can see this brokenness at work. Many people in international development will say rightly that these are political problems that require political solutions. But I would argue that they are not solely political issues, and if we treat them as such, the solutions are likely to fail in the long term. Political dysfunction doesn't spring from nothing. I would argue that it emerges from an impoverished public conversation that pays insufficient attention to what is good and to our shared rights and obligations. And at root, that failure lies in both structural sin. We have created social structures that militate against us doing good to one another, and in our individual sin, which is really another way of describing the barriers that we place between ourselves and God's love. From a Christian perspective, the perfect complexity of the Trinity is the fullest expression of relationship, and it's this fullness of relationship to which we are called. Only when we acknowledge the need to restore relationships and recognize our radical equality as created in the image and likeness of God, can we undergo the personal and political changes needed to sustainably end poverty. If Christianity offers alternative ways of approaching the idea of progress, it can also help in addressing a second challenge of how we build towards the idea of the common good. There are at least two levels at which this needs to be cultivated if we're to provide a firm foundation for development, at the community level and in the political sphere. Now, these two levels should feed each other. There are certain things that only states can do because of their complexity and scale. Expectations of the state's role in supporting the common good have evolved over time, expanding from such minimal functions as the provision of security to include universal coverage of essential services such as healthcare and education. Yet there remains a vital distinction between what the state can and should guarantee or compel and what it should enable. An active culture of ethical engagement at the community level and the enabling of people to sustain a viable livelihood is critical to the creativity, generosity, and productivity that underpin the common good. It is also a critical counterweight to the undue exercise of state power. One test of whether we're living in deep relationship is whether we're able to identify and contribute towards the common good. Yet we live in a world of such disfiguring inequalities that we are often unable to articulate what it is that we value collectively. Those same inequalities, by creating fear and hunger and marginalization, prevent many people from being able to participate in the common good. So, pursuing the common good hinges on a prior level of equality and a balance between state, market, and civil society in which each plays their proper role and none dominates. These ideas of mutual flourishing and of the common good bring me to my final point. Both of them rest on a foundational idea set out in Laudato Si of the world as our common home. The history of development is littered with parables of expert hubris leading to environmental destruction and degradation. Often that destruction has been the price of economic growth, especially in the poorest countries where regulation is often weak and poverty can drive people to take short-term decisions with long-term costs. Polluted and depleted soils, forests, rivers, and oceans destroy livelihoods, create hunger, and immiserate communities. Humankind is exceeding the world's hard environmental constraints, most obviously through changes to our climate, which are devastating many already poor and marginalized people, from pastoralists to farmers in flood zones to communities living in slums in the megacities of Africa and Asia. Our collective failure to live within our environmental limits reflects a world of unequal wealth and power and social status. The climate emergency exemplifies this injustice. The people who are first and worst affected by the problem are those who've done least to contribute to it. And untrammeled consumption and exploitation of the natural world by people in the richest countries is threatening now to jeopardize the development prospects of the poorest countries and the lives of future generations. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis traces this crisis to our alienation from God and describes how it has eroded our sense of createdness and our connection to the natural world of which we are a part. In destroying the created order, we are, quite literally, making ourselves homeless. Dominant approaches to development have played a key role in fostering this sense of separateness by treating the earth and everything in it as an economic resource or else as a sink, without proper consideration of its intrinsic value. Rowan Williams writes of autonomy and control as values of modern and late modern culture that can blind us to our dependence on God and to our interdependence on each other. Often, the elevation of autonomy and control has been an understandable reaction to people's negative experience of inequality and social hierarchy, including in religion. Yet it also risks obscuring the fact that to be fully human is to receive as well as to create. From a Christian perspective, acknowledging our dependence on God is not, as Rowan Williams describes it, to submit to an alien will, but to open ourselves to a life-affirming source from which we have received the gift of creation itself. By opening ourselves to this gift, and by accepting the vocation to live in harmony with creation, we can offer a world beset by ecological and social crisis a more hopeful vision of the future.